Welcome to Older Militarist Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics, and what we do is all for free, and for the love of Jesus Christ, and for Holy Mother, the Church. We'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. As we continue with Agent Sniper's information, today we're going to get into a little bit more background on Operation Trust, and how even at that time, and just right after the Bolsheviks in Wall Street murdered the Tsar and his family, that the spying apparatus of the Bolsheviks were way ahead of everybody. And what Agent Sniper provides also shows how behind the game the CIA and others in the United States were, and how they had to catch up really, really quick. Moscow was an experienced player in the game of espionage. Throughout the 19th century, the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, had perfected the technique of infiltrating undercover agents into dissident groups immediately after the 1917 revolution. The Bolsheviks' first intelligence organization, the Cheka, adopted its predecessors' methods to penetrate and undermine counter-revolutionary organizations. But as an exhaustive semi-official history of Soviet intelligence recorded, it also expanded its efforts from purely domestic opponents to target the new state's international enemies. Within days of taking power, the Chekists began agent penetration into hostile organizations to see what they were secretly doing and decompose them from the inside. It proved to be remarkable good at this. For the next 40 years, the Cheka and its successors, the NKVD, the MGB, and KGB, now FSB, I added that part, ran extensive and successful worldwide intelligence operations. The apotheosis of these schemes was a 6-year-long internal and global operation known colloquially as Trust. Between 1921 and 1926, Cheka agents set up fake anti-Bolshevik resistance organizations, which both enabled the Soviet state to identify and nullify its internal opponents, and crucially to fool Western governments into supporting them. By the time it shut down, the Trust had fed strategic disinformation to the intelligence services of 11 countries and banked substantial donations of hard currency from London and Paris. The sting operation would form the template for subsequent Soviet bloc espionage services throughout the Cold War, including one which badly damaged the American-led attempt to foster resistance in Poland, and was so successful that its techniques were still being analyzed in Washington almost a half a century after it ended. In stark contrast, the Central Intelligence Agency was a novice in the great game. When Sniper sent his first letter, the agency had only been in existence for a decade. It was driven by internal rivalries, as well as fighting simmering turf battles with the FBI, the State Department, and the Pentagon. It was also at war with sections of Congress. Excuse me. The CIA welded together from the chaotic mess of dozens of rival bodies competing for supremacy in America's post-World War II foreign intelligence landscape. The road to its inception began in February 1946 when the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, George Kennan, sent a lengthy telegram to Washington warning that the Kremlin was determined to pursue confrontation with the West. We have here a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with US there can be no permanent modus vivendi, that it is desirable and necessary that the internal harmony of our society be disrupted, our traditional way of life be destroyed, the international authority of our state be broken, if Soviet power is to be secure. Everything possible will be done to set major Western powers against each other. Efforts will be made in such countries to disrupt national self-confidence, to hamstring measures of national defense, to increase social industrial unrest, to stimulate all forms of disunity. Sound familiar, anybody? Or the left and those of goodwill, like Order Militaris Catholicus, are on the right side of history, supporting Ukraine over still Bolshevik Russia. While those on the right in the conservative world, especially in the United States, and their talking heads of Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, and Stu Peters and others are in the wrong and have been infiltrated by still the old game of Operation Trust. And we can see by their actions and words that they are actual foreign assets to the Bolshevik Russia of today. Yet they have not filed paperwork saying they are such. So they are, in fact, breaking the law. So let's continue. This, Kennan argued, posed an immense and urgent problem. He described it as undoubtedly the greatest task our diplomacy has ever faced and probably the greatest it will ever have to face. The only way to counter this new menace, at least without recourse to military conflict, was for the United States to place its unarmed forces on a war footing. It should be approached with the same thoroughness and care as the solution of a major strategic problem in war, and if necessary, with no smaller outlay in planning effort. In July 1947, President Harry S. Truman accepted the need for a single civilian foreign intelligence organization and signed the National Security Act. The Central Intelligence Agency was born. Immediate parentage, however, was confused and conflicting. Two distinct branches of government jointly controlled the new agency, and each had different priorities. Truman wanted the CIA to focus on providing him with strategic information on America's enemies. The Department of Defense demanded military information and covert action, while the State Department saw the agency as a vehicle to bring about a worldwide political change favoring to U.S. interests. It was a recipe for disaster. Although the chain of command was gradually streamlined throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, the CIA's track record was distinctly poor. It failed to anticipate or at least provide intelligence with which would have predicted Soviet takeovers in Czechoslovakia, Romania, nor did it foresee China's military support for its fellow communists in the Korean War. Worse, a succession of covert operations in Ukraine, Albania, Poland, and Russia failed dramatically. The agency had supported a succession of local immigrant organizations, and financed parachute drops of armed insurgents into several of the Soviet-controlled territories. These volunteers agents were promptly captured and subsequently killed by secret police forces lying in wait for them. It was clear that the missions had been betrayed from within, raising the very real specter of KGB penetration into U.S. intelligence. In September 1952, CIA Director General Walter Bedell Smith confirmed the sobering assessment, warning that communists had infiltrated almost every branch of U.S. intelligence. In a sworn disposition read into congressional record, he admitted, "I believe there are communists in my own organization. I'm morally certain there are. They are so adept and adroit that they have infiltrated practically every security organization of the government." Are you telling me Senator McCarthy is right? Everybody in Congress, even today, still saying he was nuts. Railroaded him, attacked him, smeared him. My, oh my. Senator McCarthy, traditional Latin Mass Catholic from Wisconsin, go Green Bay Packers, as you would say, was right. Yet they made his life in Congress, in the Senate, a living hell, because he is about to expose this Operation Trust within the United States government and within the United States itself. No wonder we have Republicans who are pro-Russian or Russian assets to the old guard of the Bolshevik Russia of today. No wonder KGB, the Kremlin, and Russian intelligence agency supports and promotes Tucker Carlson. Are these sleeper agents? I wonder. We know for sure Tucker because of his dad was a War Gonzo reporter, which is Russian state television. But we don't know about Marjorie Taylor Greene, Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, and a few others. Okay, back to Agent Snaper's information. In stark contrast to Moscow's success, the CIA had almost no equivalent insight into the Kremlin's global plans, much less what its espionage services were doing to further them. These successive failures were not due to the lack of resources. By 1952, the agency had a budget in excess of $500 million, operated more than 50 stations worldwide, and employed 15,000 people, though remarkably few of them could read or speak Russian. Yet 6 months later, an internal report admitted that their labors had produced distinctly patchy results. And here is the internal report. The adequacy of intelligence on the Soviet bloc varies from firm and accurate in some categories to inadequate and practically non-existent in others. We have no reliable inside intelligence on thinking in the Kremlin. Our estimates of Soviet long-range plans intentions are speculations drawn from inadequate evidence. Here we go. On 27 January 1952, Moscow very publicly rubbed the agency's nose in its failures. Headlines in newspapers throughout the Soviet bloc countries celebrated the discovery of a combined American and British intelligence plot to form an anti-communist revolt in Poland. For 4 years, the CIA and Britain's Secret Service MI6 had fostered the resurgence of a wartime resistance group. The Freedom and Independent Association, most usually referred to as WIN, both believe that it was a substantial, well-trained force with 500 soldiers inside Poland's army and 20,000 partisans and 100,000 sympathizers behind him. All they needed were weapons, equipment, and money. The agency and MI6 duly parachuted in guns, ammunition, two-way radios, and gold at the cost of $5 million, equivalent to $55 million today. The anticipated uprisings never happened. When, as the Kremlin-controlled media reported with relish, had been under the joint control of the KGB and Poland's intelligence service, UB, all along. In a carbon copy of the Chika's 1920s Trust, the operation codename Zari had been designed to identify and ultimately liquidate domestic anti-communist dissidents, to deceive Western spy agencies, and to relieve them of hard currency and materiel. It was another deeply humiliating failure for the CIA, one which highlighted an urgent need to reassess and recalibrate its covert war on the Soviet bloc of nations, as Theodore Teddy Shackley, then a young agency officer working on Polish affairs, later recorded. The sight of my colleagues wrestling with the realization that 5 years of strategic planning and many millions of dollars had just gone down the drain convinced me that more attention had to be paid to the protection of our own personnel, operations, and installations. I get a drink, folks, so I'm going to just make sure I don't lose my place here. The much-needed review was not commissioned for another 2 years. In July 1954, President Eisenhower ordered Lieutenant General James Doolittle, a decorated World War II Air Force veteran, to conduct inquiry into the security adequacy and efficiency of the CIA. His report, sent to the White House 2 months later, made the largely grim reading. Doolittle gave the agency some credit for surviving its early chaotic years, which were marked by a lack of continuity in policy direction and management, as well as inheritance of mixed and sometimes mutually antagonistic elements from predecessor agencies, but damned the overall American espionage efforts against the Soviet Union as inadequate. He warned that due to continuing rivalry between the agency and other outposts of U.S. intelligence, the important covert operations have been blown because the CIA and military intelligence units were operating against each other, emphasis in original, without knowledge of each other's interests or activity. Not all of this was the agency's fault, but structurally, the organization was not, in Doolittle's estimation, fit for purpose. It had ballooned out into a vast, sprawling organization manned by the people of dubious competence. Although many were veterans of wartime intelligence, they were simply not winning the new Cold War against the vastly experienced Soviet bloc espionage services. Because the United States is relatively new at the game, and because we are opposed by a police state enemy whose security measures have been built up and maintained at a high level For many years, the usable information we are obtaining is still far short of our needs. The lack of human intelligence spies working for the United States behind the Iron Curtain was the fundamental reason for the often lethal intelligence gap between Washington and Moscow. Because of the tight security controls that have been established by the USSR and its satellites, the problem of infiltration of human agents is extremely difficult. Escape from detection is extremely difficult because of constant checks on personal activities and personal documentation. The information we have obtained by this method of acquisition have been negligible. The cost and effort, dollars, and human lives prohibitive. Doolittle concluded by recommending a wholesale reorganization of the CIA and streamlining its operations, not least by bringing its various branches then housed in 43 different buildings scattered across Washington, D.C. under one roof. The cost of constructing what would eventually become its Langley headquarters in Virginia would be vast, but then money was not one of the agency's many problems. From its inception, the CIA had been largely insulated from oversight on Capitol Hill. No, notionally, two congressional committees, Armed Services and Appropriations of Defense, had the right to oversee its budget and activities. The reality was, as the agency itself later acknowledged, that neither truly did so. In actual practice, awareness of the CIA's and other intelligence agencies' activities was limited largely to the chairman and the ranking minority members of those committees and subcommittees. Oversight, such as it was, typically worked out by Director of Central Intelligence and few senior members of the Congress, with little involvement of the Congress as a whole. In the same period, Senator Joe McCarthy's televised Red Scare hearings and often sensational testimony for the House Un-American Activities Committee inflamed public opinion and created a widespread popular belief that the communist agents had infiltrated the United States government and entertainment industry wholesale. Against this backdrop, the CIA gradually came under attack for failing to protect the country from Moscow's machinations. Well, Senator Joe McCarthy was right. In April 1956, Michael A. Fegan, a veteran anti-communist and Democratic congressman since 1943, took to his feet in the House of Representatives to make a speech outlining the threat posed by Moscow and its satellites. The essential issue of our times is the case of Russian communism versus human freedom. We Americans have been hoping and praying that communism, with all its evils and threats to peace, could be banished from the face of the earth. Communism carries with it the seeds of its own destruction, but the group of criminals in the Kremlin is now embarking upon a new type of warfare against all civilizations. Well, Senator. Representatives. Sorry. Yes, communism could have been ended very early on. Um if President Woodrow Wilson would have kept supporting Admiral Kolchak and the White Russians, who had the Russians pretty much defeated, you would have ended communism right there before it even got started. Then we have the Polish War in 1920. Where they defeated the Bolsheviks. If they were properly supported and funded and equipped, they could have finished off the Russians. If General Douglas MacArthur was not fired because of his military brilliance and wanting to do the end of communism, they wanted to go into communist China and finish them off. That would have stopped what we have today with China. But then there is another one, a relative of mine who was murdered, while everyone else escaped the car unhurt. General George S. Patton Jr. He wanted to take his Third Army and go right at the Russians where they were weakest and finish them off. But the Masons had other ideas. And so communism grew and grew and grew. Was protected. And we have what we have today in Ukraine. And the Russian assets or agents in U.S. House of Representatives and Senate TV are now demonizing anyone wanting to defend a peaceful and independent Ukraine. Demonizing their own veterans who decided to stop with our military because of the medical procedures. Take their talents, their training, and their specialties to help defend a Christian nation of Ukraine. Just recently, we had a Navy SEAL die in Bakhmut. Better winds and following seas is Years later, he returned to the House floor to make a ringing denunciation of the CIA's record, encountering the Soviet menace. They did not seem to have qualified men in intelligence to come up with the correct information. You cannot evaluate faulty information and arrive at any useful results. I think it is about time there was a complete investigation by Congress of our intelligence agencies responsible for this faulty information of intelligence if you use the misnomer that comes from the CIA. There is abundant evidence that our top officials are receiving faulty information with respect to critical issues around the world, which causes us to make blunders, which reduces our prestige in the world. The most glaring gap in U.S. intelligence armory of Cold War weapons was the death of defectors from inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Although the 1949 Central Intelligence Agency Act established Program PL-110, a new power which allowed the agency to import up to 100 defectors annually outside regular immigration rules. By 1958, the CIA had attracted only 3 major defectors from within Soviet bloc intelligence circles. The depressingly small return on investment on one which Doolittle noted in 1954 had attracted the era of the competing U.S. intelligence services. The exploitation of Soviet and satellite defectors outside the United States has been a source of annoyance, even hostility, on part of some of the military services and other agencies towards CIA. Steps should be taken immediately to ensure full implementation of the defector program. More damning, Doolittle had concluded that although the agency is properly focusing a great deal of its efforts in the direction, the information thus far obtained was sporadic, incomplete. The evidence pointing to a Soviet bloc intelligence role inside the CIA hardened in early 1958. Shortly after arriving in Bern, Lieutenant Bagley made a tentative and almost instantly unsuccessful bid to recruit a young Polish UB officer also stationed there. It was not a high-profile operation, nor even particularly well planned. Bagley surreptitiously delivered a letter to the target, inviting him to consider working for the agency. Yet somehow this low-key scheme had been leaked to Warsaw within a fortnight of its receiving the blessing of the CIA headquarters in Washington. Inevitably, the approach failed. At the time, this was marked down as little more than a routine and fairly minor flop. But within a year, it would be revisited and picked over as evidence of possible penetration by a uniquely powerful unit within the agency whose job was precisely to protect it, and by extinction, the United States from infiltration by Moscow spies. Lieutenant General Doolittle's scathing report on the agency's structures, personnel, and capabilities had led to the substantial reorganization of its myriad separate branches. The most significant innovation was the creation of a dedicated and highly secretive counterintelligence staff. In theory, the two rival branches were equals inside the agency's labyrinth-lined bureaucracy. In reality, and as internal history noted, while the CIA staff had access to all the CB's internal files, it had no insight into the activities of the CIS. This imbalance placed enormous power in the hands of the man who headed the CIA staff. James Jesus Ingleton was 37 years old when he took control of the newly formed counterintelligence staff in December 1954. A tall, cadaverous figure who wore heavy-rimmed eyeglasses, habitually favored an old-fashioned Homburg hat, yet spent more than a decade in the business of detecting and combating enemy espionage. He was also a member of Skull and Bones. After graduating from Yale and then Harvard Law School, he had been drafted into the U.S. Army in 1943 and posted to the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's wartime forerunner, America's first foreign intelligence and covert action organization. Since the United States was so new at the spying game, in the midst of the war faced a steep and urgent learning curve, the OSS relied heavily on British intelligence, which had a long hinterland in the business. England was assigned to the new counterintelligence branch X2, which had only been established that year under the tutelage of the United Kingdom's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. He learned his trade at the feet of an experienced MI6 officer named Harold Kim feebly. Two of Ingleton's experiences during the World War II played a vital part in forming his approach to the great game. The first was his role in Italy, which he ran agents inside the Axis countries. And as Germany's defeat became inevitable, he negotiated secret surrender deals with the SS intelligence officers based in Rome. It was a covert operation which would, in time, impact on the CIA's attitude to Cold War defectors. The second and rather less hidden influence was his exposure to the highly successful British double-cross system, which, under the aegis of John Mastermind, a former Oxford University academic turned MI5 officer, turned captured Nazi spies and double agents working on behalf of the United Kingdom. Ingleton absorbed and thereafter took as his guiding principle Mastermind's advice. The more valuable an agent service, the more reason to fear a deception. The greater the truth, the bigger the lie. So my commentary was Jesus Ingleton was James Jesus Ingleton, the Soviet mole inside of Russia. Why do I say that? Because the MI6 officer named Harold Kim Fibley was also a KGB agent. And him and his protege, Ingleton, always messaged every back and forth on certain operations within the CIA as old chums and old friends and teacher to student stuff. Potential double cross or deception in spy jargon, a dangle or provocation, as his power increased within the CIA. Presumption became paranoia, and he slowly became lost in what he would later call the wilderness of mirrors, a constantly shifting landscape in which he was almost impossible to distinguish between reality and reflection, as the agency's own history records. Ingleton became convinced early in his career that the Soviet Union's KGB for many years successfully run major deception operations against the West in general, and the United States in particular. He became convinced that the KGB had penetrated the CIA at high levels, and that it had taken advantage of these penetrations to successfully run agent provocations against the agency. It was sudden this backdrop that the CIA intercepted and took it to itself Sniper's sudden and mysterious letter to the FBI. The offer of information on the Soviet bloc espionage was on the table. Given the agency's troublesome run of intelligence failures, it was, in theory, exactly the windfall needed. The question was whether the CIA, more particularly James Jesus Ingleton, was willing to trust it. My last commentary before we close off the program. James Jesus Ingleton talked frequently to his teacher, former MI6, now KGB agent Philby. Who does this remind you of? Who's also trying to help Ukraine, but also backstabbing it, but also talking to Vladimir Putin in France. Emmanuel Macron. The same setup, same tactics, same everything as what James Jesus Ingleton was doing with Kim Feebly. Think about it. Nothing has changed, folks. Day is full.